I think what's happened over the past few days has been a well-organized referendum. Now, that's being said very much against the backdrop of how big and how underdeveloped South Sudan is. Now, given those problems, there were always going to be logistical difficulties of making any election perfect. But I think given the conditions, they've done very, very well. And I think that people have been very, very responsive and been very enthusiastic about voting. And the whole voting procedure, for the most part, with one or two exceptions, has been extremely peaceful. So I think that the referendum should be counted a great success.
It's a new era, perhaps, of maturity within Africa, that the North and the South have been able to negotiate this referendum, and that, in essence, the North has said, I mean, everyone knows pretty much that the South will vote for independence. And the North has said, at least nominal, that they would accept this. So I think it represents an era of maturity and an acceptance. Although Sudan, I must say, is a unique case, but an acceptance that a form of separatist democracy is now attainable. And this is quite interesting for Africa.
I think there's going to be a very genuine emphasis from both North and South to aim for a degree of reconciliation in any case. Because don't forget, there are still going to be Southerners living now as foreigners in the North, and vice versa. The two countries have got to get on. The South is still going to be very dependent on the North for all kinds of infrastructural and logistical support. I mean, transport routes is one very key thing, for instance. So there's a very great deal of vested interest in both sides to try to keep some kind of working peace.
Well, the southern infrastructure is very, very limited. I think they will face an enormous weight of expectations, and they will need a lot of assistance. Most of the development has been in the north. What the south does have on its side is of course, the oil. They already have had a functioning government for a number of years, because the South essentially has already been semi-autonomous since the CPA was signed. So it's not as though you're creating an entirely new government from scratch. The government is in place. But getting the infrastructure sorted is going to take time. There's a lot of global development agencies there already in South Sudan. I think one of the tests will be to kind of join the dots and get them to work together.
I think the South Sudanese people in general just want to make a new start. They want to go into the future. I think they are prepared to put the past to one side. This is not to say things will be forgotten completely, but they do know that it's going to be a new start, a new future, and I think that it won't take long before the realization dawns that they have an awful number of problems that they've now got to sort out by themselves. China, of course, because they already have a vested interest in the petroleum resources of Sudan. And China has signaled its willingness to cooperate with the government of the South. And during the period of transition, during the GPA period, China has been very assiduously courting the government of South Sudan. So I don't expect any major dislocations in the relationship between China and the new government of the new state.
Egypt is a factor in this, partly because of the Nile water issue, and also because, of course, North Sudan has had quite good links with Egypt, and Egypt has an interest in the referendum and in what happens after Sudan. And this, I think, will force an increased dialogue.
There is a certain amount of suspicion by many African countries, and certainly many Middle Eastern countries, and certainly a great number of Islamic countries outside of the Middle East, about the interests of Israel. Now, there are all kinds of suspicions about Israel, but I think that at this stage most of them are unfounded. I mean, there are a number of, as it were, Israeli interests in Africa already. They have a very close relationship with, of all people, Robert Mugabe, for instance. They had, at least, I'm not sure whether they still have, such a close relationship with the government of Eritrea. They've played major roles in terms of assisting the governments of those two countries in their post-liberation phases. Israel comes with a whole baggage of suspicions attached, of course. One of them is what they might want to do themselves with the Nile waters. But there's a very easy answer to that question. They can do nothing with the Nile waters. Logistically, it is impossible for them to transport the waters of the Nile in any discernible quantities from South Sudan back to Israel.
I would say this is an example of Pan-African success, particularly in the case that just a few years ago, there were so many question marks about whether the referendum would happen because the two sides were really at loggerheads over it, and whether it could be held on time. So just to have it on time, to have the referendum is itself a success, not just between the Sudanese, but also in terms of the Pan-Africanists, because Africa, the AU, the region, has come together and said, very forcefully, we want this to happen, and we want it to happen as peacefully. So I think it's an example of Pan-Africanist success. The caveat, of course, is what happens after. Hopefully, it's not going to lead to violence and bloodshed. There's a lot of uneasiness about that.
What is now about to happen, and that is independence for the South. And of course, that sets the scene. It sets almost like a precedent for other countries in Africa, like Somaliland, for instance. And the Somalilanders have been watching very, very closely what is happening in South Sudan. They're the only viable other candidate. The African Union is not going to contemplate with any seriousness at all the propositions for independence, for instance, on the part of the Western Saharan people. So you've got the possible knock-on effect in terms of Somaliland, but nowhere else really. But yes, the African Union would have preferred a unified Sudan. Now, of course, it's got to face an additional prospect of what to do with the rebel forces in Darfur to the west of Sudan, where there's a very, very different kettle of fish, where there's no unity of movement as in the south, and where many of the rebel groups are fragmented and really amount to no more than bandit movements trying to loot the international assistance that has flowed into Darfur.
What we're seeing now with the emergence of commodity and resource countries, with Africa now, in a sense, joining the BRICS and so on, and the other emergent economies, that Africa has become newly self-confident. We've become players on the global stage. And this old idea that it is the international community which will rescue Africa, I think, is becoming rather obsolete. It's now becoming, of course, Africa will need partners, but I think the other question now is becoming also an issue of what Africa can do for itself, because there's a lot of internal African investment occurring, and also what Africa can do for the world.